The morning light came through the tall windows of Windsor Castle in long, pale strips, the kind of light that made everything look older than it was. Dust floated in it. Portraits stared down from the walls. And, somewhere deep inside those ancient corridors, a decision had already been made, one that nobody had thought to mention to Camilla. That was the thing about royal families. Decisions traveled like whispers through drafty hallways. By the time they reached the wrong person, they had already hardened into fact. Princess Charlotte was 11 years old that spring, and she had her mother's eyes. Not just the color, the steadiness in them. The way they held a room without demanding it. People who met Charlotte for the first time often came away feeling oddly seen, as if the child had looked straight through the performance of them and found something real underneath. It was a gift, and it was unmistakably Diana's. The press had been saying so for years, and, for once, the press was not wrong. The occasion was a formal evening reception at Windsor, one of those events that appeared on the royal calendar months in advance and was arranged down to the placement of every flower and every fork. It was the kind of event where appearances carried weight, or what a person wore said more than anything they might actually say. The royal family understood this better than anyone. They had been speaking the language of appearances for centuries. Charlotte had been permitted, for the first time, to attend a significant formal evening engagement. It was a milestone, gently negotiated between her father and the palace advisors over several weeks. Prince William had wanted it to feel natural for her, not overwhelming. He had spoken with her about it the way he spoke with her about most things, directly, honestly, without the performance that so many adults wrapped around difficult conversations with children. He told her it would be long and a little boring in places. He told her people would stare. He told her she could handle it because she already knew how to be herself in a room full of people who expected her to be something else. Charlotte had listened. Then, she had asked about the tiara. The Spencer tiara had not been worn publicly in years. It lived in memory more than in any vault, attached permanently in the public imagination to a single image, Diana, on her wedding day, walking toward a future that none of them could have predicted. The tiara was delicate and intricate, a piece of craftsmanship from another era, and it carried within it something that no piece of jewelry technically should. It carried grief. It carried love. It carried the particular ache of a woman who had been extraordinary and was gone too soon. William had not made the decision lightly. He had thought about it for a long time, alone first, and then, in conversation with his children. He wanted Diana present at milestones. He had always wanted that. At his own wedding, at significant public moments, he had found ways to bring her forward, to make her absence feel less total. Letting Charlotte wear the Spencer tiara was another version of that. A continuation. A quiet insistence that Diana had not simply ended. He had spoken with his sister-in-law, with members of the Spencer family, with the palace's official advisors on protocol. He had not, in the ordering of those conversations, spoken first with Camilla. This was not an act of malice. It was an act of oversight, or perhaps something more complicated than oversight, a reflection of the invisible lines that still ran through that family like fault lines under stable ground. William loved his father. He had made his peace, or something close to it, with the shape their family had taken. But, when it came to Diana, certain things still moved in him without his full permission. He did not always remember to include Camilla in the conversations that centered on his mother. It was not a decision. It was a pattern. Camilla found out the way she found out too many things, through someone else. A junior aide, nervous and apologetic, mentioning it in passing while reviewing the evening schedule. The aide had assumed she already knew. Most people assumed the queen consort knew everything that happened within those walls. She did not always know. And, the things she didn't know were often the things that mattered most. The reaction was not immediate. Camilla had spent decades learning to manage her reactions, to smooth them down before they could escape and become someone else's story. She had been very publicly and very thoroughly disliked for a long stretch of her life, and she had survived that by becoming controlled. Measured. She had learned to absorb shocks quietly, to process them later, in private, where they couldn't be turned against her. It was a skill born of necessity and it had served her well. But, this particular shock had an edge to it that her usual composure couldn't immediately soften. It wasn't about the tiara. She would have said that, and it would have been at least partially true. It wasn't envy of Diana, not exactly, though that was what the tabloids would have said if they'd known. It was something harder to articulate and, therefore harder to defend, the feeling of being peripheral. Of existing in the orbit of a story that had been written long before she arrived, and finding that no matter how many years passed, no matter what title she carried, she was still somehow outside the frame. She had married the king. She had stood beside him through the final complicated years of his mother's reign, through the mourning, through the coronation, through the relentless recalibration of what the monarchy was supposed to be in a world that kept asking whether it was necessary at all. She had done all of this with a certain quiet dignity that even her harshest critics had eventually, grudgingly, acknowledged. And, still there were rooms she was not quite in. Still there were conversations that happened without her. The Spencer tiara, worn by Charlotte, on a formal evening, at Windsor, it would be photographed. It would be everywhere by morning. Every photograph would carry Diana's name in the caption. Every article would describe the tiara's history, its connection to the Spencer family, its most famous appearance on Diana's head on that July morning in 1981. Charlotte would be beautiful and composed in those photographs, and she would look, people would say, remarkably like her grandmother. Camilla would not be in those photographs. She would be beside the king, as she always was, and she would be noted in the captions as an afterthought. She understood all of this before the evening had even begun. She understood it in the way that a person understands a long familiar pain, not with shock, but with a kind of tired recognition. What she had not been prepared for was how Charlotte looked when she came down the stairs. The girl was extraordinary. There was no other word for it. The tiara sat on her hair as if it had always been there, as if it had been waiting for her, and her posture was careful and proud in the way of someone who has been told something is important and has decided to honor that. She moved with a gravity that had no business being in an 11-year-old, and her face was calm. Not the blankness of a child performing composure, but something that looked disturbingly like the real thing. She looked, in that moment, like Diana. Not a copy. Not an imitation. Something more unsettling than either of those things. She looked like what Diana might have become, or like what Diana had passed forward, some quality of being that had skipped a generation or rearranged itself and arrived again in this child's face and bearing and eyes. The room felt it. The small gathering of family and aides who watched Charlotte descend the stairs went quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when something true enters them. William watched his daughter and could not entirely hold his expression together. He tried. He was his father's son in many ways, trained to steadiness, but his eyes gave him away. There was grief in them, open and undisguised, and also something that was not quite grief, a gratitude, maybe. A sense of rightness. Charles reached for Camilla's hand. She let him take it. Her fingers were cold. She was looking at Charlotte too, and she was working very hard to keep her face arranged in the appropriate expression: warmth, family pride, the benevolent approval of a grandmother figure at a milestone moment. She was working hard because the appropriate expression was not the one that wanted to come. What wanted to come was something rawer and less acceptable, something she would not have been able to name cleanly even in private. It was not hatred of the child. She needed to be clear about that, at least to herself. Charlotte was blameless. Charlotte was 11. Charlotte had simply put on a piece of jewelry that her father had given her, and she had come down the stairs, and she had looked like someone who was not Camilla and never would be. The evening had not yet begun, and Camilla was already exhausted by it. Later, the people who had been in that entrance hall would remember the moment differently depending on who they were and what they had already decided to believe. Some would say Camilla had been perfectly composed. Some would say she had gone briefly pale. Some would say they had seen something flicker across her face before she controlled it. None of them would say what it actually was, because none of them had a word precise enough for it. What it was this, the recognition that she would spend the rest of her life in a house where the ghost was better loved than she was. Where the ghost could appear in the face of a child and make a room fall silent with something that felt almost like reverence. Were she, Camilla, with all her titles and all her years of quiet work and all her careful management of a public image that had once been entirely destroyed, she would still, in certain moments, be the wrong person in the room. She held the king's hand. She kept her face arranged. She watched Charlotte move through the gathered family with the tiara on her head and Diana's steadiness in her eyes. The evening had not yet begun. Outside, the photographers were already assembling. By morning, the images would be everywhere. By morning, the captions would be written. By morning, the world would have another story about Diana, told through the face of her granddaughter, and Camilla's name, if it appeared at all, would appear in a sentence that was really about someone else. She knew all of this. She had always known all of this. Knowing it had never made it easier to stand inside it and keep her face still. She kept her face still. The doors opened. The evening began. And Camilla walked into it as she had learned to walk into everything, composed, present, and carrying something she would not put down and could not set aside, something that had no name. The palace corridors were large enough to hold. The reception moved the way all palace receptions moved, slowly, formally, with a kind of practiced grace that looked effortless from the outside and required enormous effort from everyone involved. Trays of champagne appeared and disappeared. Conversations were begun and concluded with the calibrated politeness of people who had been trained in the art of saying a great deal while revealing nothing. The rooms were warm with candlelight and the particular golden hue that Windsor produced in the evenings, a light that had been falling through those windows for centuries and had learned, by now, how to make everything look important. Charlotte moved through it with a composure that continued to unsettle people who expected her to be nervous. She was not nervous. Or if she was, she had already made some private arrangement with her nerves, told them to wait outside, promised to collect them later. She spoke when spoken to, listened when others spoke, and managed the specific royal art of making a conversation partner feel attended to without giving them anything they could repeat afterward. She was 11. She should not have been this good at it. William stayed close to her without hovering. He had calibrated the distance carefully, near enough to be present, far enough to let her stand in her own space. He watched her the way parents watch children who are doing something that both delights and undoes them. Every few minutes his gaze drifted to the tiara, and something moved in his face that he didn't fully suppress. He had not expected it to hit him this hard. He had thought he was prepared. He was not prepared. The Spencer tiara caught the candlelight in small, shifting ways, and every time it did, William was somewhere else, briefly inside a memory he hadn't chosen to revisit. His mother's voice. Her laugh, which was louder than people expected. The way she sat at the edge of a child's bed and made the whole room feel smaller and safer at once. He came back to the present each time within a second or two, but the travel was real, and it cost him something, and by the middle of the evening he was carrying a weight that hadn't been on him when the night started. Camilla was on the other side of the room. She was speaking with an ambassador's wife about a charity she supported, and she was doing it well, attentive, warm, precisely the right degree of interested. She was very good at this. She had always been very good at this. It was one of the things that people who had actually spent time with her acknowledged, even the ones who had spent years hoping she would fail. Camilla in a room was composed and charming and capable of making a stranger feel, within minutes, that they had known her a long time. Inside, she was somewhere else entirely. The conversation continued on the surface. Her mouth moved. The right words came out in the right order. Some part of her brain handled it with the automation of long practice, freeing the rest of her to be elsewhere, watching Charlotte from across the room, tracking the tiara as it moved through the candlelight, feeling the particular quality of attention that the room directed toward the girl whenever she passed through it. Rooms notice some people more than others. It is not always about beauty or status, though both play their parts. It is something older than either, a quality of presence, a signal the body sends that the mind doesn't fully control. Diana had always had it. Charlotte had it too, and, in this room, on this evening, with that tiara on her head, it was impossible to miss. Eyes drifted toward her. Conversations paused when she was near. People who had been speaking about something entirely unrelated found themselves, somehow, watching the girl. Camilla noticed all of it. She noticed all of it while discussing charitable initiatives in a warm and genuine-sounding voice, and the noticing sat inside her chest like something with weight and heat. It was not the first time she had felt this. She had felt versions of it for years, the room's attention moving toward Diana's memory, toward Diana's sons, toward anything that carried Diana's name or image or echo. It had become familiar. She had made her accommodation with it, or thought she had. She had told herself, and told Charles, and told herself again, that she understood her place in the story. That she was not competing with a ghost. That she had made peace with the fact that the public would always love Diana more, would always hold Camilla responsible for things that were far more complicated than any tabloid headline could contain, and that this was simply the shape of the life she had chosen. She had believed this. Most of the time she had believed it. Then, Charlotte had come down those stairs. Somewhere between the third and fourth hour of the reception, a small thing happened that was not small at all. Charlotte was standing near a group that included several senior members of the household staff, people who had worked at Windsor for decades, who had known Diana, who had memories of that era that were sharp and specific and personal. One of the older women, a woman who had been part of the palace's inner workings since the 1980s, reached out and, very gently touched the edge of the tiara. Not in an overstepping way. In the way of someone who recognized something beloved and could not help themselves. And then, the woman's face did something complicated and private, and Charlotte, seeing it, took the woman's hand and held it for a moment without saying anything. The older woman cried. Quietly, briefly, with the practiced restraint of someone who had learned not to make scenes in royal spaces. But her eyes went wet and her throat moved and something crossed her face that was grief, open and undisguised. Charlotte held her hand. She didn't say anything. She just held it. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Then, it was over and the conversation resumed and the evening continued. Camilla had seen it. She had seen it from across the room, over the shoulder of the ambassador's wife, and something in her had gone very still in a way that was different from her usual stillness. That stillness was the warning she should have listened to. She excused herself from the conversation with practiced ease, a word about needing to check on something, a warm smile, a graceful exit that looked entirely deliberate. She moved through the room toward one of the smaller side corridors that connected the main reception hall to the private family areas of the castle. These corridors were quiet. They were used by staff and by family members who needed a moment outside the performance. Camilla had used them before, in difficult moments. The castle had a geography of retreat, and she knew it well. She stood in the corridor. The sounds of the reception came through the walls, muffled conversation, the distant clink of glassware, music playing at the exactly correct volume for background ambience. She stood there and breathed and tried to locate the composure that had served her through every difficult moment of the past 3 decades. It was there. It was always there. She was very good at finding it. What she had not accounted for was William following her. He had seen her leave. He had watched her trajectory across the room with the awareness of a person who had been tracking someone's mood all evening without acknowledging that he was doing so. He had followed. He would later struggle to explain why, out of some instinct that was not entirely kind and not entirely unkind, something in between, something guilt-adjacent, the pull of a person who knows they have set something in motion and cannot decide whether to face it or let it go. He came around the corner into the corridor and found her standing there, her back partly turned, one hand pressed flat against the stone wall. Her posture told the story that her face could not, because her face was not visible. Her spine was rigid. Her shoulders were doing something they did not do in public, carrying something, visibly, with the difficulty of it showing. He stopped. He should have left. The decent thing, the simple thing, would have been to leave her the corridor and the 30 seconds and the privacy she had gone there to find. He did not leave. Camilla. She turned. Her face was composed. It was a remarkable piece of work, how quickly she composed it, a fraction of a second between registered and controlled. But he had been watching her for years, and he knew the version of her face that was composed because she wanted to be and the version that was composed because she had to be. This was the second version. William. Her voice was even. Pleasantly even. The voice of a woman who was managing very carefully. I was just catching a breath. He looked at her. He had his mother's eyes, people said, and, in this moment they were using them in a way that was uncomfortable, seeing through the composure, reading the thing under it, not looking away. I should have told you, he said. About the tiara. Before. She held his gaze for a moment. Then, something in her broke slightly, not all the way, not in a way that would make a scene or leave any wreckage, but enough. A crack in the controlled surface, thin but real. Yes, she said. You should have. 2 words. They carried a great deal. He absorbed them. He stood there and took them in and did not defend himself, which was the right thing to do and also the harder thing, and she noted that he did it. She had spent years noting the things William did right, quietly, without comment, as a kind of private accounting that she could not share with anyone. I'm sorry, he said. She looked at him for a long moment, really looked at him, in the way that happens in corridors outside parties, when the performance has been briefly suspended and 2 people are standing in the actual space between them rather than the managed one. I know you are, she said. It was not forgiveness. It was not absolution. It was something more careful and more real than either, an acknowledgement that the thing was real, that the sorry was real, that the space between them was real, and that all of it would remain complicated in ways that a corridor conversation would not resolve. She straightened. Her spine reorganized itself. She pressed the flat of her palm against her dress, a small smoothing gesture that she made when she was setting something aside, not discarding it, just placing it somewhere she could carry it without it showing. We should go back in, she said. He nodded. He didn't move immediately, and she didn't either. They stood there for a moment that stretched past its natural length, 2 people in a stone corridor while a reception went on without them on the other side of the wall, and, somewhere in the room beyond them, Charlotte moved through candlelight with Diana's tiara on her head and Diana's eyes in her face. Then, Camilla walked back toward the door. And William followed. They returned to the room. The ambassador's wife was speaking with someone else now. The older household member had composed herself and was accepting a glass of water from a young aide. Charlotte was in conversation with her grandfather, the king, who was watching her with an expression that Camilla had seen on his face in private for years, tenderness that he didn't know how to fully express in public, love that had learned to live behind the careful face he wore for the world. Camilla rejoined him. She stood beside the man she had loved for decades, the man whose children would never fully let her in and whom she did not blame for it and could not stop feeling the weight of, and she composed her face into the appropriate expression, and she looked at Charlotte, and she allowed herself one true thing. The girl was extraordinary. Whatever complicated feelings Camilla carried, whatever the room's directed warmth toward Diana's memory cost her, the girl was genuinely extraordinary. The kind of person who held an old woman's hand for 30 seconds without saying a word and somehow gave her something real. The kind of person who wore borrowed history on her head and made it look like it had always belonged to her because, in all the ways that mattered, it had. Camilla looked at Charlotte. She let herself see the child clearly, without the filter of her own pain. The clarity lasted only a moment. Then, she smiled at something Charles said, and the evening continued, and the weight settled back to where it had been. Familiar. Known. Carried. Outside, the night had gone fully dark. The castle walls held all of it, the candlelight, the conversation, the careful distances between people who loved each other imperfectly and tried anyway. And, somewhere in the press pool beyond the gates, cameras waited for Charlotte to emerge, waited for the photograph that would be everywhere by morning, waited for the next chapter of a story that had begun long before any of them. The story always continued. That was the thing about this family. The story always continued, and everyone inside it had to find a way to be in it, to carry their part of it, without being crushed by it, without letting it crush each other, without forgetting that underneath all of it were people, just people, doing the imperfect and ongoing work of being alive inside a history that was larger than any of them. Camilla knew this. She had always known this. Knowing it did not make standing inside it feel light. But she stood. She always stood. That, too, was something. The photographs came out the next morning, as Camilla had known they would. She saw them before Charles did, which was not unusual. She woke early, had always woken early, long before the day required her to, and she lay in the gray light for a few minutes before reaching for her phone. She moved through the morning news the way a person moves through cold water, deliberately, without flinching, already knowing that it would be cold. There was Charlotte, on every major publication's front page, in every news feed, across every platform. The tiara caught the light beautifully in every image. Whoever had been photographing the reception, and there had been official photographers, careful and pre-approved, this was not a candid situation, had known what they were doing. Charlotte's face was clear and composed, and the tiara sat on her head with what could only be called rightness, and every photograph was stunning in the particular way that photographs become stunning when they are carrying something beyond their own content. The images were not just pretty. They were full of something, of meaning, of connection, of the specific weight that Diana's name still carried in the world, more than 25 years after her death. The captions were everything Camilla had predicted. A tribute to Diana. Charlotte honors her grandmother. Diana lives on. The Spencer legacy continued. Every headline returned, eventually, to that same place. Every article circled back. Diana. Diana's tiara. Diana's granddaughter. Diana, still. Camilla scrolled through them in the gray morning light, her face showing nothing, because she was alone and, she had learned, over the years, that composure practiced in private was composure that held in public. She read the captions. She looked at the photographs. She set her phone down. She lay still for a moment in the quiet. Then, she got up and went to find tea. The day had its own requirements. There was a schedule, as there always was, dense and arranged and requiring her to be present in specific rooms at specific times in a specific configuration of expression and engagement. The monarchy ran on schedule the way other institutions ran on other things. The schedule did not pause for the photographs or for what the photographs were doing inside her. She moved through the morning. Charles joined her for breakfast, and they sat together in the comfortable quiet that long marriages develop, not a silence that lacks for words but a silence that has decided it doesn't always need them. He read his newspapers. She drank her tea. Outside the windows the castle grounds were green and still, and birds were doing the things birds do in the morning with a cheerfulness that bore no relation to anything happening inside those walls. He did not mention the photographs. He mentioned Charlotte, briefly, said she had done wonderfully, said he was proud, said something tender and quiet about the tiara that Camilla absorbed without responding to. She made a sound that was agreement adjacent. She looked out the window at the grounds. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. He knew. He always knew, eventually, when she was carrying something. He was not always the most articulate man in terms of addressing it directly, which was a kind way of saying that he had spent most of his life learning to express his feelings through action rather than language, through the small physical gestures that meant things he didn't always have words for. The hand over hers was one of those gestures. It meant, I know. It meant, I see you. It meant, I am sorry, again, in the way that some things require ongoing sorriness rather than a single resolved apology. She turned her hand over under his. She held it. The morning continued. The outburst, when it finally came, was not what anyone would have imagined it to be. There was no scene at breakfast. There was no confrontation with William, no dramatic corridor reckoning under palace portraits. It did not happen in any of the symbolic rooms, not the reception hall, not the formal dining room, not anywhere that the tabloids would have staged it. It happened in a garden. The back gardens of Windsor were not the public ones, not the manicured stretches that appeared in royal photographs and tourist brochures. There were sections of the grounds that were genuinely private, used only by the family, and which had absorbed decades of things the family needed to do somewhere without being watched. Walking. Sitting. The specific variety of being that public figures have to do in private because they have no other place to put it. Charlotte had come looking for her. This was not entirely surprising, though Camilla had not anticipated it. The girl had always been more perceptive than comfortable, more willing than most children to walk directly at a thing that others would have navigated around. She had found Camilla in the walled section of the garden, or a bench sat under a tree that had been old when the current building's foundations were being poured. Camilla was sitting on it with her morning tea gone cold in a cup beside her, looking at nothing in particular, doing the private version of the processing that she could not do in the public areas of her life. Charlotte sat down beside her. She did not ask permission, which was the kind of thing about her that could either irritate or disarm, depending on the moment. In this moment it disarmed, because the directness of it was honest, and Camilla had a tired appreciation for honesty that morning that she might not have had on a different day. They sat. The garden was quiet. Somewhere a bird was performing its morning with great enthusiasm. A cloud moved across the sun and back again. "I saw the photographs," Charlotte said. "Everyone saw the photographs," Camilla said. Charlotte considered this. "They were pretty photographs." "Yes." A pause. "They were." Another silence. This one was different from the one at breakfast, less comfortable, more deliberate, the silence of two people who are deciding whether to go somewhere real or to remain on the surface. Charlotte went somewhere real. She was 11. She didn't always know to be more careful. "Does it bother you?" she asked. "When people write about Gran. When they talk about her all the time. Does it bother you?" Camilla looked at the child. The morning light was soft and the garden was green and the question was in the air between them with nowhere to go. She could have deflected. She was very good at deflecting. She could have given the appropriate answer, the measured, gracious, senior royal answer about how wonderful Diana had been and how natural it was that people still loved her and how Camilla herself held Diana in great esteem. She had given versions of this answer publicly for 20 years. She could have given it here. She did not give it here. "Yes," she said. "Sometimes it does." Charlotte looked at her. The girl's face was open, not hungry for drama, not trying to extract something, just open. Actually listening. The way she had held the old woman's hand the night before, without commentary, without agenda. Just present. The yes had come out and now it was sitting between them, and Camilla waited to feel the discomfort of it, the exposure, the incorrectness, the sense of having said a thing that should not have been said. But the discomfort did not come in the form she expected. What came instead was something quieter. A relief of a kind she hadn't known she was waiting for. She had carried the yes for so long. She had carried it in the corridor with William and at the breakfast table with Charles and in every room where Diana's name was spoken with a reverence that had no place for Camilla's feelings about it. She had carried it across 20 years of newspaper headlines and royal occasions and a country's ongoing grief that she had never been permitted to be part of, that she had always been positioned against. She had never said it to anyone. She said it now, to an 11-year-old in a garden, and the weight of it shifted slightly. Not gone. Not resolved. But different in the way that named things become different from unnamed ones. Known, now. Present in language. Charlotte did not react in the way that adults reacted when something uncomfortable was confirmed. She did not backpedal or apologize or immediately begin to smooth it over. She sat with it for a moment, genuinely sat with it, and then she said something that Camilla did not expect. "I think she would have wanted you to say that." Camilla looked at her. "Gran," Charlotte said, without any self-consciousness. "I think she would have wanted it to be allowed to bother you." She didn't like it when people pretended things were fine when they weren't. Camilla held the girl's gaze for a long moment. She did not know Diana. She had known of her, had existed, for years, in a relationship to Diana that was defined entirely by opposition, by the public story of the love triangle, by the tabloid narrative that had cast Camilla as the villain of a fairy tale that the world had decided to believe completely. She had never had a conversation with Diana. She had no access to what Diana had actually been like, beyond the accounts of others, the public record, the footage and photographs that everyone had seen. She could not have said whether Charlotte was right about what Diana would have wanted. But she felt something when Charlotte said it. Something that was not quite belief and not quite gratitude and not quite grief but had elements of all three, mixed together in a proportion she couldn't quite identify. She felt it in the chest, which was where real things tended to land. Your father should be proud of you, Camilla said, after a moment. Charlotte accepted this without preening. He's proud of you too, she said, with the matter-of-fact delivery of someone stating a thing they consider established fact. He said so. To George. I wasn't supposed to hear, but I have very good ears. The corner of Camilla's mouth moved. Not quite a smile, something more controlled than a smile, more private, that had the shape of one. They sat in the garden a while longer. The cloud moved across the sun again. The bird finished its morning performance and started it over. Camilla's tea was entirely cold beside her, and she did not reach for it. She was thinking about something that had no clean conclusion, about the nature of being inside a history you did not write, about the difference between enduring a story and being part of one, about whether those two things could ever be fully separated. She was thinking about Diana, which she did not often allow herself to do, and thinking about Charlotte, and thinking about the old woman's wet eyes the night before, and thinking about William in the corridor, and Charles's hand over hers at breakfast, and all of the small moments that made up the strange and complicated life she had chosen and been given and carried and continued to carry. She was thinking about what Charlotte had said. She would not know, could never know, whether it was true. Whether Diana, the real one, the complicated one, the woman behind the icon, would have wanted her grief to be acknowledged, her complicated feelings to be given space, her years of being the villain to be set down, even in private, even in a garden, even in a single word said to a child. She would never know. But the word had been said. And it sat in the garden between them, aired out finally, in the green morning light, under a very old tree. Not resolved. Nothing about any of this was resolved, and Camilla understood by now that resolved was probably not the thing to aim for. Some things in a life did not resolve. They settled. They became part of the structure. They lost, gradually, the sharpest edges of their weight, and became something you carried differently, not without weight, but differently weighted. Not without pain, but differently configured. She had been carrying this particular thing for 20 years. It had changed shape many times. The shape it had now was one she recognized but could not entirely name. Maybe that was enough. Maybe the naming of the yes in the garden was enough of a step for one morning. Maybe a person could only do one true thing at a time, and the next true thing could come later, when the next moment presented itself. Charlotte stood up. She stretched in the unself-conscious way of someone whose body has not yet learned to manage itself for an audience. I'm going to find Dad, she said. We're supposed to do something boring and official this afternoon. Most official things are boring, Camilla agreed. You're very good at pretending they're not. Camilla looked at the girl. So are you. Charlotte considered this, decided to accept it as the compliment it was, and went. Her footsteps were clear on the path and then, they weren't, and the garden was quiet again. Camilla sat alone in the old garden with her cold tea and the very old tree and all the weight that had its home inside her. A pigeon landed nearby and examined the ground with the focused skepticism of a creature that has been disappointed by pavements before. The morning continued. The schedule waited. The photographs were still everywhere, would be everywhere for days, Diana's name in every caption, Charlotte's face carrying something forward that Camilla would never be part of and could not change. She sat there a little longer anyway. She allowed herself the garden. She allowed herself the yes, still in the air where she had put it. She allowed herself, for a few more minutes, the specific relief of having said a true thing to another person and not been destroyed by it. Then, she stood. She smoothed her dress with the flat of her palm, that small gesture, that familiar setting aside. She picked up her cold tea. She walked back toward the castle, toward the day's requirements, toward the schedule and the official photographs and the public face and the long, unfinished work of being who she was inside the life she had. She walked back into it. The garden was quiet behind her. The tree stood as it had stood for longer than any of them would stand. The morning held, briefly, the shape of everything that had been said in it, the yes, the child's voice, the cold tea, the pigeon, the old particular relief of being known by one person in one garden, for one ordinary morning, without performance or management or the long careful work of her own survival. It held it. Then, the wind moved, and it was gone, and Camilla was inside, and the day had begun.